Welcome back to the deep dive. It's one thing to track your cloud costs, but today we're talking about something a lot more strategic. We're talking about measuring the effectiveness of your entire FinOps practice. We are diving deep into the FinOps assessment capability. This is really the engine that moves you from just, watching costs to actually maturing your financial operations.
It really is.
So our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going through the official FinOps framework material to figure out how a practice can measure its own success. We're looking for something that's repeatable, measurable, and, thoughtful. Because if you can't measure your FinOps team, how do you improve it?
Exactly. The whole point of the FinOps assessment, it's not just to create another report for a shelf.
Right.
It's designed to give you real actionable insights into your strengths and, maybe more importantly, where the big areas for improvement are lagging. The ultimate goal is always creating cloud value. Assessments are just the roadmap to get there.
Okay, let's get specific on that. When the framework says you're assessing a FinOps capability, what are we actually measuring? And why is this the bridge our listener needs?
A capability is basically a specific area of practice. Think of something really concrete like anomaly detection or maybe commitment management.
Got it.
The assessment is the bridge because it forces you to stop just, admiring the problem or current state and start defining a measurable goal state. It's how you connect that technical maturity with what the business actually wants to achieve.
And you do that by attaching KPIs, key performance indicators, to that goal.
Yes. That's what lets the team see exactly where they're not meeting objectives today. It turns, a vague aspiration into an actual project plan.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, let's unpack the mechanics here. The framework lays out this clean, cyclical, three-phase process. Let's start with phase 1, define assessment goals.
This step sounds simple, but it's deceptively so. A lot of teams just rush into surveying everybody.
Yeah, I could see that happening.
The successful ones, they start small and smart. You have to pick which specific capabilities you're going to assess first. If your biggest headache is utilization, why would you start by assessing chargeback accuracy?
Right. Focused effort. And there's some jargon here we should probably clarify. Target groups. You can't just survey the engineers, can you?
Oh, absolutely not. The target group is the human side of this, and it has to be cross-functional. It's a subset of your organization, a representative mix of all three FinOps personas.
The engineer, the finance person, and the product owner.
Exactly. You need all those different viewpoints to get an honest 360-degree view. If only engineering participates, you might find out that your resources are technically optimized, but you completely miss that the product manager has no idea what their future roadmap is costing.
That highlights a huge mistake, right? Focusing only on the tech when the real problem is like political alignment or just bad communication.
It often is.
And that takes us to phase 2. Set assessment baseline. How do we actually capture this initial data?
So once you have your capabilities and you've identified your target groups, then you figure out your process and your tooling. The FinOps Foundation actually has some great open source resources.
Like the assessment tool?
Yeah, the assessment tool, various paper inputs. You perform that initial assessment at a level of detail that's right for your organization. The goal here is just to get your day zero score, the truthful, sometimes painful starting point.
And because this is a journey, not a destination, phase 3 is all about continuous assessment, setting up a cadence.
Yes, you have to set a schedule for reassessment or for maybe bringing in more teams. You're constantly checking in, reevaluating if the initial goal still makes sense, and reassessing to make sure you're driving that maturity across the whole org.
So we know the mechanics, but let's talk strategy. If I'm a new FinOps practitioner, I might be tempted to just assess everyone and everything immediately to, prove my worth. Why is that a bad idea?
Because the assessments are just so much more effective when they're targeted. If you try to assess all, 40-plus capabilities across 10 different teams at once, you'll just end up with a giant spreadsheet and zero buy-in. It becomes bureaucratic, busy work.
Yeah, it's just noise at that point.
It is. You get much deeper, richer data, and you spark more meaningful dialogue by focusing on a subset of capabilities and a small, representative target group.
And I remember reading that the core FinOps team should always self-assess first. Is that about practicing, or is there a political reason for that?
It's a bit of both. It's definitely about practicing the process, making sure your own house is in order. But politically, it shows vulnerability and commitment. If you're going to go audit the rest of the organization, you need to show you're willing to apply that same scrutiny to yourself.
It builds trust.
It builds a ton of trust, which is essential.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we shouldn't forget that secondary goal you mentioned, just doing these assessments is a collaborative activity in itself.
Absolutely. I like to think of it as a kind of organizational therapy.
I like that.
It's a structured way to get engineering, finance, and product in the same room, talking about the same things, using the same words. It fosters good cost behavior, breaks down silos, and it really reinforces that culture of cost awareness.
So when a team gets a low score in, say, shared cost allocation, the assessment itself is what starts the conversation to fix it.
Exactly. It surfaces the problem in a non-confrontational way.
Okay, this is where we shift from the tactical to the strategic. How this all scales as an organization matures. We have those iconic 3 stages: crawl, walk, and run. Let's start at crawl.
Crawl maturity is for organizations with pretty simple or minimal cloud use. The focus here is just on building the discipline. So the scope is narrow. They'll do an annual assessment, usually just for the core FinOps team. It's an internal pulse check.
And the documentation is pretty pragmatic at this level, right? They're setting future annual goals with KPIs, but the assessment itself might just be in a shared Google Doc or a spreadsheet, whatever works.
Yeah, keep it simple. The transition to walk, though, that's where things get serious. This is when an organization's cloud use is getting more widespread, more complex, and often a bit messy.
And that means the frequency ramps up. You're moving to a semi-annual or maybe even a quarterly assessment for the core team.
Correct. And the scope starts to get a lot sharper. You're specifically looking at capabilities where those high-level KPIs are not being met. You move from a general checkup to a targeted diagnosis.
And here's the first big friction point, right? The structure. At walk, the assessment needs a consistent format.
This is so vital. If your crawl assessments were in 3 different Google Docs and 2 spreadsheets, you can't compare anything. A consistent format is what allows you to make meaningful comparisons between different groups and, critically, over time.
That standardization is huge. And what about the people? How does that scale in the walk stage?
You usually appoint a dedicated FinOps assessor on the core team. Someone who owns the process, maintains a documented question bank. You start pushing the assessment out to business units, often working with FinOps champions, but, and this is key, it's not on a regular cadence yet.
So it's more opportunistic or driven by a specific pain point.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the top, the run stage. This is for the big, complex enterprises with highly distributed cloud use. Think federated FinOps.
Right. Now you're doing frequent quarterly assessments within the core team, and you're assessing more capabilities, all of it informed by your broader FinOps KPIs.
The structural demands here must be mission critical.
They are. The assessment has to have an internally consistent format. You need to be able to compare, say, Q2 results for the marketing team versus the product engineering team, and then compare both of those against last year's Q2. That requires serious data discipline.
And the personnel model, it completely changes. This is where the knowledge really decentralizes.
It has to. You go from one assessor to multiple trained FinOps assessors on the core team. But even more, the FinOps champions or the business units themselves now have their own trained assessors. They're running these assessments locally on a regular, scheduled cadence.
So the assessment stops being a project from the central team and becomes just business as usual.
It's an operational activity owned by the local teams.
But isn't there a lot of organizational resistance to that? I mean, creating a central repository of everyone's scorecard and proactively sharing training, it feels like you're exposing everyone's weaknesses.
And that is the challenge. The run stage isn't just about tools, it's about cultural maturity. In this stage, BU assessment results are shared back to the central team and with partner teams. You have a central repository of past assessments with standard questions.
You need a huge amount of leadership buy-in and psychological safety for that.
You do. If the results are seen as a way to punish people, they'll just game the assessment. It only works when the organization sees transparency as a strength, not a weakness.
That shifts the discussion beautifully to accountability. Who actually owns this process? And how do you make sure that open dialogue you mentioned actually happens?
The ownership is shared. The FinOps team facilitates it. But the assessment itself needs that open, honest dialogue from everyone.
Okay, so let's break down the roles. The FinOps practitioner, what's their job here?
They're the advocates for consistency and accuracy. They make sure there are enough assessors, and they're the ones who take the outcomes and set the broader goals. They own the governance of the process.
Then you have the other personas: product, finance, procurement, engineering. They all share a commitment to being open and honest. So a product manager has to feel safe saying, yeah, we rushed that launch and didn't tag properly.
And that transparency has to lead to action. These personas need to advocate for assessments in their own BUs and share the results with their teams, but the real goal is integration.
Right, the payoff is application. They have
Mhm.
to bring the learnings into their daily jobs.
Exactly. For an engineering team, a low score in workload right-sizing should immediately impact architectural decisions, maybe future sprint planning. It's not just a report, it's a mandate for change.
And for finance and procurement, this data would feed directly into budget planning or commitment purchases.
Yes, it closes that loop between the practice and the policy. It makes FinOps truly embedded, not just some siloed team.
And holding it all together is the leadership role. What are their commitments?
Their commitment is what provides the top-down support. Leaders have to define clear, measurable goals for the business cost targets, visibility percentages, so the FinOps team can actually assess their impact. They provide the resources when refactoring is needed.
And crucially, they have to encourage the BUs to participate and support that culture of transparency.
Without that leadership buy-in, the whole thing just becomes a compliance checklist that nobody cares about.
Okay, so if the goal of the assessment is to improve the capabilities, how do we measure if the assessment program itself is any good? Beyond the specific capability KPIs, how do we know this whole structure is effective?
That's where you need program-level KPIs. The FinOps team needs metrics on adoption, rigor, and governance, not just on technical optimization. For example, you should track the number of FinOps assessments completed per year, and you should segment that by the capabilities you assessed.
So that shows you're being diligent and focused.
Yes,
And you'd want metrics showing the breadth too, right? Like the percentage of business units assessed, or even the percentage of the entire FinOps framework that you've assessed in the last cycle.
precisely. That's measuring your governance reach. And my favorite program KPI, the one that really shows cultural maturity, is the number of employees trained in completing FinOps assessments.
Ah, yeah. Because if it's only the core team, you're still stuck in crawl or walk.
Right, but if you have 50 champions across the organization who are all trained assessors, you know you're running towards real maturity.
And for organizations that want to see how they compare to others, this isn't some secret process.
Not at all. You can benchmark your performance against industry averages by checking the state of FinOps data. That lets you draw external comparisons while you track your own internal progress. It helps make sure your definition of run isn't just an internal bubble. So to sort of summarize the journey we just took, the FinOps assessment really moves you beyond simple cost reports. It becomes the structured, cross-functional driver of your organizational strategy. It's the framework that helps you define where you are, where you want to go using measurable KPIs, and it gives you that crawl, walk, run engine to actually get there.
It sets the goal state, it creates the path, and most importantly, it fosters the collaboration you need to turn theory into actual practice. This isn't a one-time audit. It's about continuous maturity. The complexity of getting to that run stage, with multiple assessors, a regular cadence, and that central repository of results, it really highlights a massive cultural shift. So as you think about accelerating your own FinOps maturity, maybe ask yourself this: how much of the FinOps knowledge in your organization, the best practices, the common failures, how much of that is just tribal knowledge living in a few key people's heads? And how transformative would a central shared assessment repository be for accelerating that maturity for everyone? We really encourage you to check out the FinOps Assessment Guide and tool to start that transformation. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.